It is now my great honour and delight to welcome Matthew Fox, who has been part of the Common Dreams program, and we are delighted tonight that he is experiencing a wider audience and that you have an opportunity to hear him. Matthew was introduced last night at our venue at Newington College, but there are many more people with us tonight, so I just wanted to tell you a little bit about him before we begin. Matthew is an internationally acclaimed spiritual theologian, Episcopal priest and activist who was a member of the Dominican Order, the Roman Catholic Dominican Order, for 34 years. He has devoted 45 years to developing and teaching the tradition of creation spirituality, which is rooted in ancient Judeo-Christian teaching, inclusive of contemporary science and world spiritual traditions, welcoming of the arts and artists, wisdom-centered, prophetic, and committed to eco-justice, social justice, and gender justice. After a long campaign, Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, as Chief Inquisitor and head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, silenced Matthew for 1 year in 1989, and 3 years later he expelled Fox from the order, whereupon Matthew became an Episcopalian priest. Matthew has reinvented forms of worship and awakened millions to the much-neglected, earth-based mystical tradition of the West, revivifying awareness of spiritual teachers such as Hildegard of Bingen, Meister Eckhart, Thomas Aquinas, and closer to our era, Thomas Merton, and other pre-modern and postmodern spiritual pioneers. He is an absolutely prolific author. He has authored more than 35 books on spirituality and contemporary culture. And I know that many of you who are with us tonight have been touched by Matthew's writings, and along with me, are delighted to have the opportunity to hear him speak. Tonight, Matthew's topic is on being deeply human in a time of earth crisis and apocalyptic warnings. Please join me in welcoming Matthew Fox.
Thank you. Thank you, Margaret, for your hospitality, this special place. Thank you to the choir, the chorus, for that wonderful music, bringing spirit in so many ways. And thank you for your beautiful music. I'm a friend of Alessandra Belloni, who just wrote a book this year on the Black Madonna, and I wrote the foreword to it, and she talks often about that particular gathering in southern France there, so that kind of made me feel right at home hearing that with an Australian accent. So last night I spoke to the need to recover a sense of the sacred, and that the way we do that is by reconnecting to the universe itself, that the universe is the primary sacrament. It has birthed all of us over a 13.8 billion year journey, and it is still birthing all kinds of planets and supernovas and God knows what. But here we are on this particular Earth, and it is gravely in danger. So, as I suggested last night, and I'll practice again tonight, I think every gathering of humans at this time should begin with the awareness and reminder that scientists and the United Nations gave us last year, that we have 11 and a half years left to undergo a profound change in order to arrest the climate change happenings and the other disappearance of so many species that is bearing down upon us. And with that in mind, we agreed on this topic, on being deeply human in a time of earth crisis and apocalyptic warnings. And I really derived this title, the first part of it, from an ancient Native American, Mesoamerican statement that goes like this: to be human, one must open one's heart to the mysteries, to the wonders of the universe. To be human, we must open our hearts to the wonders of the universe. Sometimes, very often, humans act less than human. In fact, Rabbi Heschel says, sin is a refusal to become human. The refusal to become human. Every other being is doing its best to be itself. How many of you have seen the movie The Bear? It was a movie made in France. It took 12 years to make, and it's often acknowledged as perhaps the best movie ever done on an animal. It took 12 years to make, called The Bear. And I saw it with my Native American friend, Sister Jose Habde, a Seneca woman and Franciscan. And afterwards, we went out for tea. And we discussed the following question. What's a bear? And what's the bear's job on earth? The bear's job is to be a bear. And they're really, really good at it. And look around. All the other species are being very good at being themselves. We're the only ones who go wandering, staggering in all kinds of detours. And for some reason, as Ann pointed out this morning, we arouse a lot of hatred, a lot of projection, a lot of violence. And we can talk about the Holocaust, we can talk about genocide that's still going on. So we are the species that has to sober up, grow up, and mature. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. How we become deeply human in this particular time of earth crisis and apocalyptic warnings. As many of you know, the word apocalypse is a Greek word that can also be translated as revelation. And I think that is exactly the moment that we are at. Either we are going to fall into the abyss of the apocalypse, and climate change and the rest will proceed at extended speed, and we can kiss our planet as we know it goodbye. There will be a race for survival across the board, for water, for soil, for clean air, all the things we can no longer take for granted. Either we're going to fall that way into the apocalypse, or we are being invited at this very special moment. Everyone who's living on the planet today is being invited at this very special moment into the arena called revelation. And what would that mean? It would mean the unveiling of what it truly means to be human. The best of ourselves. Carl Jung says it's to the mystics that we owe what is best in humanity. And let me say that listening today to the various wonderful panels and teachings that went on, I'm very deeply moved as an outsider, in the sense of a non-Australian, to hear honest talk about the plight of the Aboriginal people in this land. And I've never thought of the Aboriginal people as just being in this land. They are my ancestors as well as yours. We all began in Africa, and in some ways, I guess we could say the Aboriginals were the first ones out. They led the way. And they've got this ancient culture. As far as I know, it is the oldest ongoing tribe on the planet. And I have to say, as an outsider, I am astounded that you people who call yourself Australian do not realize what a resource you have here in terms of the spiritual genius. We're not going to resurrect Mother Earth without resurrect the wisdom of the indigenous peoples who have been here far longer than our Bible-based cultures and our empire-seeking cultures, way back before patriarchy, we had so many versions of feminine wisdom that was allowed to dance and to sing and to play and to make pots and to discover. And this is all part of the surge of the return of the divine feminine today, and of course of the empowerment of women today. And all men worthy of the name man would welcome the return of the goddess and the return of the divine feminine and the return of circles as opposed to hierarchical ladders by which our species can learn anew how to survive. Father B. Griffiths, a very authentic monk and human being who lived for over 50 years in an ashram in southern India, though he was British, he said, if Christianity cannot recover its mystical tradition and teach it, it should just fold up and go out of business. It has nothing to offer. Well, when I look around, I see a lot of Christianity folding up and going out of business. And it's because we have ignored that deepest dimension of what it means to be human, which is to be a lover. That's what a mystic is, a lover. A lover and a warrior. And the biblical word for warrior is prophet. As Rabbi Hesher says, the primary work of the prophet is to interfere. So there's the lover and there's the defender of what we cherish and what we love. And we can throw around words, oh, I love my children, I love my grandchildren, I love my great-grandchildren. But if we are not actively involved in trying to stop this apocalyptic engine, this train that is going full speed, that is literally destroying soil, water, air, other species, we are not loving our children. We're just talking. So I think it's important at this time of apocalyptic noise to talk about what the mystics call the dark night of the soul. I believe that as a species today, we are in the dark night of our species. Rabbi Hesher used to say, we shouldn't just talk about the dark night of the soul, but the dark night of society. But I'm carrying that one step further. We are in a dark night as a species, because what is characteristic of the dark night is that we do not know how we're going to get out of this. It feels like complete darkness. And there are many people today who are tempted by despair. There are some people today who are committed to despair, who are saying it's all over for our species. And they're writing books about this and giving conferences on it. I've met some of them. They're making money on it. It's all over. And what they say is, we're the ones in denial because we think there's still something we can do about it. And of course, we know there are young couples who are debating whether they dare to bring children into the world in this apocalyptic time. Hafiz, the wonderful Sufi mystic who was a contemporary of Meister Eckhart in the early 14th century, he came right after Rumi, Hafiz did. He said, I see soldiers dying in excruciating pain all around me. All around me I see soldiers dying in excruciating pain. But you could become a victorious horse person, carrying your heart through the world like a life-giving sun, S-U-N, but only if you and God become sweet lovers. So he's showing the contrast between soldier and warrior. The soldier is given an order, kill or be killed. The warrior is something else. The warrior is into his or her heart, into the wounds of the heart. The chorus sang about that this evening. The wounds of the heart, not denying the pain. This is what the dark night is. You go into the pain. But you come out a lover and a mystic. And there is a temptation of despair because, as Hafiz says, the warrior deals with the wounds of the past as well as the ghosts of the future that come after us and want to barf all over us, he says. The ghosts of the future. That's despair, because hope and despair are about the future. And fear is, of course, a birthplace of despair. And there's a lot of fear in our world today. And I think the 9/11 experience just upped the ante on fear. So much of the media, so much of politics today is about ginning up fear. And fear will never bring out the best in human beings. As John's epistle says, love drives out fear. Buck Gostorz, a Lakota man who was a very important teacher to me and a friend, he used to say, in our tradition, in the Native American tradition of the Lakotas, he said, fear is a door in the heart that lets evil spirits in. So all prayer, he said, is about building up your heart, strengthening that heart, courage, so that fear stays at the door. It does not come in dragging all kinds of other spirits with it, such as despair. Thomas Aquinas says this about despair. He says, despair is the most dangerous of all sins. Not the worst is injustice. But despair is the most dangerous, because when we are in despair, he says, we don't care about ourselves, much less about anyone else. And so the selling of despair, which is happening today, the marketing of despair, is a very dangerous place to be. B. Griffiths points out the silver lining in despair. He said that some people experience despair as a yoga because they do not experience spirit in their lives, transcendence in their lives, until they sink down deeply into darkness and into despair. And we could think about AA, for example. People who have been on a journey of alcoholism or addiction, that very often you get to a bottom place where you do bottom out and where spirit breaks through. So even despair is not the last word. That spirit can reach us at any part of the journey that we are on. But, as Aquinas warns us, he says, the worst thing a human being can do is to teach despair. The worst thing we can do is to teach despair. So it is not enough when our media shows us the burnings that are happening all over the world, or the floods that are happening all over the world, and so forth. Information is not enough. We also need to be instructed in the causes of this, such as we were talking about last night. The fact that we've lost a sense of the sacredness of our relationship to the land, to the earth, to the soil, to the waters, that we've been taking them for granted for so long and charging in our ways, charging down, and in the process, being oblivious, being narcissistic, as Pope Francis says, of our other relationships, which are now coming back to haunt us. But all this dark night of our species, all this talk of despair and so forth, can also be a moment of radical awakening, a profound awakening, of a recovery of who we are as a species. Rabbi Heschel says the human race will not self-destruct by more information, but we will not be saved by more information. We will be saved by more appreciation. It is that movement to gratitude that is the first stage of our becoming strong lovers and warriors, therefore mystics and prophets. And that's what I want to speak to you about, is the journey, the spiritual journey, as laid out in the creation spiritual tradition. Because I think this is a way, that'd be great, thank you. Oh, that'd be nice. Is that right? Okay, I'm not going to have this on long. That's great, thank you. Does this work? Do what you have to do. Sure.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, great. It's on?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think that naming the journey here is a down-to-earth way to talk about our growing stronger and more authentic as a species. And for example, Rabbi Heschel says, there lies in the recesses of every human existence a prophet. But what are those recesses? How do we get to that depth where we become prophet, where we become authentic warriors? And let me tell you that my first awakening of the difference between soldier and warrior was from a Native American who was in my doctoral program, and he told us how he came back from Vietnam, and his elders said to him, "You've been a soldier, now we're going to make you a warrior." I said, "What was the training like?" "Well, it lasted 4 years. 4 years. Now, in my country, I hope this isn't true in yours, but maybe it is, the journalists are so lazy that they mush together soldier and warrior. They think every soldier is a warrior. That's the language that we're getting in my country. 4 years training to be a warrior after you've been a soldier, it ain't the same thing, being a soldier and being a warrior. And I said to him, "Well, what was the training like?" Well, the first thing they taught him was to play the flute, the wooden flute. This Native Americans are very at home with. He said, "I mastered the flute." So they gathered the whole tribe. It was like a recital one night. Everyone came, and I played the flute beautifully, he said. And at the end of the night, every elder came up with a knife in his hand and took a chunk out of my flute. At the end of the night, I had no flute. I said, "Well, that sounds like Meister Eckhart, who says our souls grow by subtraction, not by addition." He said, "What Indian said that?" Well, I said, a 14th century Dominican heretic, like myself. Oh, he said, "Well, I asked that because each of the trainings in becoming a warrior was like that. They taught me, they took it away. They taught me, they took it away." So the lesson of letting go, even when you're doing something beautiful, even when you're doing your best, even that is not to be clung to. So in the creation spiritual tradition, the model I've always used for the spiritual journey is an open-ended spiral. Open-ended because we're continually growing, continually growing. Meister Eckhart says, God is delighted to watch your soul enlarge. God is delighted to watch your soul enlarge. So we're not here to sit on our souls, keep our souls clean and pure and cash them in at the end of your life. We're here to grow our souls. And as Eckhart also says, when you grow your soul, you become younger, not older. He says, I'm younger today than I was tomorrow. And if I'm not younger tomorrow than I am today, I would be ashamed of myself. And so we become more inclusive, more curious, more morally outraged at injustice. So then, the first naming of the path. Now, this is very different from climbing Jacob's ladder, which was a traditional way of talking about the journey that I thoroughly reject because it's so obviously patriarchal and phallic, but also because, like patriarchy is, it's a flight from the mother, from the earth. Mater and materia, a flight from matter, as if you have to climb away from Mother Earth to find the divine. That's not my experience at all. So the first journey in the path is the via positiva. Now, I used to apologize for a little Latin, but actually a little Latin goes a real long way today. So, be at home with it. The positive way, the positive path, meaning the experience of beauty, of awe, wonder, joy, delight. When you've been blessed with a healthy family and in a healthy cultural situation, this is the first step of the journey, the breakthrough of awe and wonder. This is what opens our souls up. And the response then, the organic response, is gratitude and reverence. And reverence. Mary Oliver has a wonderful line where she says, well, let's see, I think I'll pull it out here so I quote her exactly right. I think I have it here. Here it is. No, it isn't. Oh, sorry about that. Well, she says something like, I like to associate, here it is. Okay. Let me keep company with those who say, look, and laugh in astonishment and bow their heads. I want to keep company with those who say, look, laugh with astonishment and bow their heads. I heard her speak a couple years ago. She's deceased now. She was 83. She filled an auditorium in downtown San Francisco. And at the end of her talk, she said, I want to talk to the young people here. I'm 83. I want to tell them everything I've learned about life, everything I've learned about living. Number one, she said, pay attention. Number two, be astonished. Number three, share your astonishment. That's everything I've learned about life, she said. This is my gift to the young people. The via positiva. Pay attention, be astonished, and share it. That's why we're here. So this is the cataphatic divinity, the God of light, the God of creation, and so forth. And it is beautiful. The Navajo people in America, their whole theology is built around beauty. So many of their poems, so many of their prayers and their songs. One of them is, I walk with beauty before me. I walk with beauty behind me. I walk with beauty above me. I walk with beauty below me. I walk with beauty all around me. Your world is so beautiful, O Goddess. So you sing that in a circle. And just the awareness that beauty is where our mysticism begins. Beauty in the West has been lost as the theological and philosophical category during the modern era. Thrown out. The pre-modern era, Eckhart says God is Pulcherimus, the most beautiful being in the universe, and all beings participate in the divine beauty. And St. Francis said God is beauty, etc., etc. But the modern age, no. Descartes has a whole philosophy with no philosophy of aesthetics, no philosophy of beauty, which may have just a little bit to do with the ecological crisis, since he's been absorbed by the educational system of practically every Western culture. The next path is the via negativa. And this has two dimensions to it. One is silence, stillness, learning silence and stillness. What we'd call meditation today, or what we'd call mindfulness, that capacity to empty our minds, to be empty, so that we can be filled. How can there be mindfulness without mind emptiness? The poem I shared with you last night from Mary Oliver, where she says, the reason we don't recognize divinity in all beings is that our minds are stuffed. We're stuffed with stuff. And we got to do some kind of emptying process to get back to reality, So silence, stillness, as the psalmist says, be still and know that I am God. That's the first part of the via negativa. And the second part of the via negativa is grief, loss, suffering. Not suffering that we make up, but suffering that we undergo. And all beings undergo suffering. It's one of the great teachings of Buddhism, that all beings suffer. Well, that's meant to be the archetype of the cross in Christians. But so many Christians have been taught within a context of anthropocentrism and fear of dying and guilt and shame. They think it's all about us. It's my sins that put Jesus on the cross. Don't flatter yourself. Don't flatter yourself. All beings suffer. The problem is, of course, the invitation is to not run from our suffering. What does Hafiz say? I don't remember if I said this last night, but if I did, it's worth hearing twice. He says, sometimes God wants to do us a great favor, turn us upside down and shake all the nonsense out. But most everyone I know, when they hear that God is in such a playful, drunken mood, quickly packs their bags and hightails it out of town. So that's the naming of the dark night of the soul, you see, which is, of course, a suffering. And today, of course, we are so in a world of loss and of grief. I say there are only two kinds of people in the world, those who know we're grieving and those who don't know we're grieving. But we're all grieving. And especially the young people are grieving. No, they don't have words for it, perhaps. But we all sense what's going on at some level of our consciousness. And so the work of grief, the work of paying attention to suffering, and of allowing the third chakra, the gut where we carry our suffering, this has to be attended to. One of the greatest failures of religion in our time is its failure to lead us in grief practices. Because I see grief as a boulder in the human heart. And it freezes us. Without melting that boulder of grief, we are not empowered to carry on and to do the creative work that we have to do to save the planet and to save our own souls, to go deep. But there's no human that gets through life without an experience like Jesus had on the cross. It's archetypal. And it has nothing to do with either you're a good person or a bad person. All people suffer. And that's one of the lessons from the cross. Now, the third path is the via creativa, the path of creativity. What we're beginning to get here is a formula, a formula. The via positiva plus the via negativa yields the via creativa. The creativity is born out of our passion for living, the via positiva, our love of living, the via positiva, and the emptying. And that's really the process in the via negativa, is a process of emptying and letting go and letting be. That's how we respond in the via negativa. Those are the habits that we learn from the via negativa, when suffering teaches to let go, that we're not in charge. And it empties us, as does meditation. Now the via creativa comes along. And that is so central to this entire journey of ours. Creativity is what distinguishes us as a species. When I wrote my book on creativity, Where the Divine and Human Meet, a few years ago, I begin with anthropology. Now, when anthropologists go looking for our ancestors, they don't just look for bipeds. They look for bipeds with jewelry next to them or creative objects next to them. Then they know that they are our ancestors. In other words, anthropologists are defining a human as a biped who makes things. That's who we are. We're all creative. And forget the nonsense that we get from our European ancestors, that some people are artists and the rest of us are just stumbling through life. David Paladin, a wonderful Navajo artist and a very profound shaman with an amazing story, he said toward the end of his life, "I'm so sick and tired of hearing white people tell me they're not artists. If you can talk, you're an artist. So get over it." Talking, think about it. Putting your experiences, your beliefs, your joys, your suffering into words, that's an art form. So, of course, we're all born in the image and likeness of the Creator. We are all co-creators. And our educational systems, they so readily forget this. In my culture, when there's a budget crunch in education, which is all the time, out goes theater, out goes music, out goes dance. They keep computers in science and math. They think that's what it is to be human. Well then, let me ask you this. How have humans survived for 200,000 years without computers? And in fact, those humans didn't end up threatening nuclear war around the world. Those humans did not render asunder their friendship with the other animals and creatures and the earth and the sacred rocks and the waters. So maybe our redemption is not going to be found in technology and more computers and more information. So it's a scandal, because when creativity is not at the center of our religious and our educational lives, our spiritual lives, therefore, when it is not at the center, we are not human. We're being instructed in how to be powerful, but not how to be wise. Oh, thank you. They can't see it. You think this will improve my penmanship? You're mistaken. My students always used to say, "Why do you go to the blackboard? We can't read it anyway." Maybe this is magic, Australian magic. Okay. Maybe there's a computer in here that tells me how to write right. So that's the via creativa. Now we move into the fourth path. Has it gotten better? One can hope. The via transformativa. Oh, there, it's fatter. The transformative way. This is the way of compassion and justice. And notice, creativity by itself is not enough, because to create gas ovens is creative. To kill more people more effectively. To create nuclear bombs and the machines to deliver them. To tear down rainforests in a day. That has taken God and nature 10,000 years to give birth to. It will never be repeated. Rainforests do not grow back as rainforests. All that is creative, but it flunks the test of justice and compassion. So that is why, to fill out this journey of what it means to be human in a deep way, we absolutely have to bring justice and compassion as into the picture. And it's a culminating path, but it's not the end. This is why it's open-ended, because justice by definition is trying to bring more people to the table. The table of what? Of the via positiva, of the joy and the beauty and the blessing and the gift that life is. So justice is not, you might say, an end in itself. It is part of the path to bring more people back to the via positiva. But the fact that we have a formula here with creativity in the center, the linchpin is creativity. The two first paths are the mystical paths. The via positiva, falling in love with life, and the via negativa, learning to let go, learning to be emptied. This is the mystical journey. But it doesn't stop there. It's not enough to be able to meditate and empty your mind. That's not enough. There's this other part of the journey, which is the prophetic journey, the warrior journey. You might call the first two paths the inner work. This is your inner work. The next two paths are your outer work. Creativity is the bridge from inner to outer. What you come to cherish in the first two paths as a mystic, as a lover, is what you are called to defend as an adult and as a justice maker, a prophet or a warrior. Now there's a special relationship between the via positiva and the via creativa. Special relationship. Why is that? Because in our creativity, we humans bring even more awe into the world. Think about the bridges we're capable of building. Think about the solar-generated irrigation systems we're capable of bringing. Think about the music, the poetry, the healings, the wonders, the teaching, the dancing, the rituals, the ceremonies. We're capable of so much that is awesome, that is beautiful. We heard it this evening, the first part of the evening, in two different forms, the chorus and our folk singer. So that's part of our job as humans, is to bring more awe into the universe. The awe of lovemaking, the awe of bringing children into the world. We have a whole book in the Bible, the Song of Songs, to celebrate that lovemaking is a theophany. And what has most of Western theology done with that? Tried to clean it up. Oh, it's not about making love. It's about Jesus loving the church, or God loving Jesus, or something like that. Ask any Jew what it's about. I've been told that one of the practices on the Sabbath is to read the Song of Songs and to make love. That's one of the mitzvahs, the good acts for the Sabbath. And in Susan Heschel's book about her father, an essay about her father, she says every Saturday afternoon, he and his wife, her mother, went to the bedroom and disappeared for 3 hours. And they were practicing the Sabbath. Hallelujah. There you go. You see how much Christianity has to learn from its Jewish roots? Now let me put another thing, since I'm on that topic. Years ago, I was invited to speak at the Lutheran School of Theology at GTU in Berkeley, and I laid out these 4 paths. And afterwards, a man came up to me. He was a Jewish rabbi who had studied with Shalem, the great historian of Jewish mysticism. And this fellow who I met that day was from Switzerland. And he came up to me, he's a short fellow, and his eyes were really big, like grapefruits. I'm so excited. He said, I'm ecstatic. I'm flying back to Switzerland tomorrow, but you are the first Christian theologian I've heard who consciously threw out those 3 paths, purgation, illumination, and union, which are not Jewish at all, he said. Of course not. They were established by Plotinus and Proclus, who never read the Bible. St. Matthew tried to live it. And he said, those 4 paths you're talking about, those are Jewish. That plus your emphasis on Christ as wisdom, now we have bridges between Jewish spirituality and Christian spirituality. But I really am honored by that encounter, because if Christianity imagines that it can renew itself without returning to its Jewish roots, it is in delusion. Anti-Semitism is not just a disease of genocide projected onto others out of hatred and fear, but is also robbing us of our richest heritage. Jesus, as we know, was not a Christian. He was a Jew. And he was fed and nurtured by people like Rabbi Heschel, people who thought this way. So these 4 paths are very deliberate rejection. Those 3 paths, purgation, illumination, and union, that naming of the spiritual journey has hung on for centuries, just like original sin hung on for centuries. And why? In those paths, there's no mention of joy, there's no mention of justice, there's no mention of creativity. So something's missing. A lot is missing. These paths, I think, are inclusive. I think these work. And I've seen them apply. I've been teaching for 45 years. And I've seen them apply in so many ways. Besides, they pissed off the Pope. So that has to say something. Well, you know, some people don't know this. I might let some people know in Australia that this Pope's encyclical, Pope Francis on the Laudato Si, on the environment, was written by a former student of mine, Sean McDonough, an Irish priest who was a missionary in the Philippines, came through my master's program, went back to the Philippines, wrote a series of books on ecology and spirituality, some of which Pope Francis read, and he plucked them up from the Philippines, took them to Rome and said, write this encyclical. So I've lived to hear, for 34 years, 2 popes called my work, quote, dangerous and deviant, including these 4 paths. And then this current pope is plagiarizing my work. So I'm very blessed to have lived a long enough life that I could call a full circle, and who knows what's coming next. But so now, when Rabbi Heschel says that there's in the recesses of every human existence a prophet, these are the recesses. Our experiences of joy, beauty, gratitude, these are deep inside every human person. Our experiences of silence, deep silence, and also our experiences of suffering are also recesses in every human existence. And instead of fighting one another over our religious doctrines or whatever it is we make up to fight about, what I want to ask the Aboriginals, how do you practice silence? And how do you deal with grief? I want to learn from that, especially because you've been around 60,000 years. And I would think every Australian would be rushing to Anne's door to ask her those questions. And I want to know how you respond to beauty and awe and what you name as the most awesome experiences of your lives. And then we go down each one of these. Creativity. We're all creative. No, we're not all opera singers and filmmakers, but many people are or aspiring to be. But the truth is, being a parent is creative. It's not a science, it's an art. And you may be a different parent to one child than you are to another because you're intuitive enough to know that this child operates this way and this child operates that way. So parenting is an art. Balancing your checkbook is an art. At least for me it is. Gardening is an art. Fixing car engines is an art. Our lives are decorating your home, the room that you're in, etc. We're always being called upon for our creativity. And of course, friendship and making a marriage work or a relationship work. That is an art form. So I'll just tell you one story of application of this, just as an example of so many people having applied them. One fellow who went through our program, got his master's degree with us, went off and got a doctorate in English literature. And he did it on Walt Whitman, the American poet Walt Whitman. And he ended up getting a summa cum laude for his thesis. And his thesis advisor said, this is the first interpretation of Whitman that's ever made sense to us. Some people go, always Buddhist, always this, always that. But no, these 4 paths, they brought out all the dimensions of Whitman's amazing soul and his amazing gifts to us. For years, I had in my faculty a musician, and he taught courses, what he would call Gustav Mahler as a spiritual director, Mozart as a spiritual director, Beethoven as a spiritual director, and so forth. He would, for one class, on each of those people would be a whole course. But he would take the 4 paths and play the music where Mozart's doing the via positiva thing, where he's doing the via negativa, talking about suffering and silence, where he's doing the creative thing, where he's doing the transformative thing, the justice work and all that. And what this does, it honors our artists and our musicians, because they're not just there to fill concert halls with people who can afford expensive tickets and who want to be seen at an opera. They are spiritual teachers. They are carrying our souls. They are nurturing our souls in the deepest way. And this model, this template, helps us to realize that. And it was amazing, the response to this fellow's courses over the years, because he was teaching people about the spiritual dimension. I was so moved that the first song sung tonight was sung in the Aboriginal language. I'm kind of eager to know what was being said, but just hearing it and honoring the language like that to kick off our evening was very appropriate and very special. How are we doing time-wise? Timekeeper. What's that? 10 minutes? 5 minutes and questions. Okay. Now I want to talk about another way of getting strong and making a difference. 2.5 years ago, I had a dream. And the dream woke me up at 4 a.m, and it gave me a command. It said, do it. Capital letters, 4 exclamation points. And it woke me up at 4 a.m. Do what? Start a new kind of order. Not a religious order, but a spiritual order. And I shared this dream with a friend who was young, a 31-year-old, and he had a dream that week too, which he felt was parallel to mine. To make a long story short, he and his girlfriend, who was 29, and myself launched this new Order of the Sacred Earth, is what we call it, Order of the Sacred Earth. And I think people in Australia may be very interested in this. It's not a religious order. It's open to people of any tradition, spiritual tradition, or none. The one vow we take that binds us together is this vow. I promise to be the best lover of Mother Earth, the best mystic, and the best defender of Mother Earth, prophet, warrior, that I can be. That's the vow that we take. Be the best lover of Earth and the best defender of Earth. We had our first vows on a solstice a year ago, and year and a half ago, winter solstice. And 80 people showed up. It was held in a Buddhist center in Berkeley. There were Buddhists, there were indigenous people, there were Christians and Jews and Hindus and Muslims, and at least one atheist. She came up to me afterwards and she said, I'm an atheist, but I'm looking for a community that shares my values. This is the kind of community I want to join. I'm in. And now there are about, last count, about 45 of these communities. We call them pods, around North America and in South America too. Now I've just been to Dublin, and I know there's going to be a lot going on in Dublin as well, in Ireland. And I want to bring this to you people too, because an order is a fine alternative for those who are being turned off by churches and organized religion. An order, by definition, is far more flexible than a church or religion. It's just like steering a great big ship. It takes forever, kind of. And then there's often a lot of blood around, too. But when I look at Christian history, Western history of religion, this is what I see. 3rd century. The church started flirting with the empire, And the young people, it was young people, like Ann talked about today. The young people have the deepest intuitions about ideals and values. They may not have the access to the PowerPoints within a culture, but they have that deep connection to their own values. And they were responding by saying, this isn't what I thought Jesus taught us to do. So they fled to the desert. Now we know them as the desert fathers and the desert mothers, but they started out as young people with values and ideals. 5th century and 6th century, Benedict and his sister Scholastica launched the Benedictine order. And of course, that's after the marriage of empire and Christianity, which happened in the 4th century. And of course, that order kept a lot of agriculture and learning and civilization alive during the dark and cold ages for centuries in Europe. Then that order went corrupt in the 12th century. It was far too married to the feudal system, political and economic. And so you had Francis of Assisi and Dominic, who were contemporaries, launching a new kind of order and had a very great impact on culture and history. Then move up to the 16th century, and you have the Protestant Reformation. I think the Reformation can be understood as a series of lay orders, because each denomination had its own charismatic leader, whether Luther or Zwingli or Knox or who have you, responding to corruption in the religion at the time. And then St. Ignatius, the same century, 16th, stayed within the Catholic Church, but still was responding to the corruption and started the Jesuit order. Then move up to today, and all I see is a lot of people leaving the churches, especially young people who are not even showing up in the first place. But I look around and say, well, what's happening? What's the alternative? I see nothing happening in terms of form, in terms of gathering for community with a passion. But I also see this younger generation, number one, passionate about the future of the earth, Extinction Rebellion and all that. Well, why wouldn't they be rebellious about their own extinction? Why wouldn't all of us be? To say nothing about the extinction of indigenous people and the extinction of 100 million species that has been going on in our time. So the fact that an order just makes a lot of sense to me, because it's something much lighter. And there's no particular ideology. It's this one vow that binds us. And we want the diversity. We want to know what you bring as a Buddhist, what you bring as an atheist or humanist, what you bring as a Christian, what you bring as an indigenous person to the table. So we try to meet once a month on Zoom and so forth and kind of report to one another. But it is about creating pods. Here in Australia, you get together in your own bioregion and say, well, what does this vow mean to me? How do we translate this? How do we put this into action? Now, when I spoke about this in New Zealand last week, one person got very excited and has already formed a group about planting trees. He's committed to planting 1 million trees in New Zealand. I think I mentioned last night, Australia is a lot bigger than New Zealand. You could really go for it. So the subtitle of our book, which the three of us have the first half of the book, and other people have a short essay at the last half. And I'd like to share with you just one short paragraph from Brian Swim, the cosmologist, his response to this idea of an order. He says, an individual hydrogen atom cannot transform itself into carbon, nitrogen, or phosphorus. An individual hydrogen atom will persist as it is without change for billions of years. At the most, it might disintegrate into an electron and a proton. It will never create anything new by itself. But the amazing fact is, if a hydrogen atom finds itself in the intense and interacting community called a star, it discovers it has the power to participate in crucial ways in its transformation into the elements that give birth to life. In the community called a star, an individual atom becomes a gateway into the next era of the universe's story. Then he says, this is what he expects to happen with the order of the sacred earth. By launching a community that is a loose community, it can be online, etc., but is also local, he thinks that we will up our ante with the dynamics that are possible to deepen us as human beings so we can be the prophets, warriors, and mystics that Mother Earth is asking of us today. And I'd like to say just a few words about this term, intergenerational wisdom, and introduce this topic this morning about the young and listening to the young. This is why these people, this 31-year-old, 29-year-old, are directors of the order. Not me, not this elder, I'm behind the scenes, but we're working together. This is so important today. I did a book a few years ago called Occupy Spirituality. And it was about young people, young adult spirituality, 21 to 33-year-olds, how we define a young adult. And in it, we sent out questionnaires all around North America. One of our questions was, what's your relationship with elders? 97% said, we want elders in our life, and we can't find them. So this order is an opportunity for the elders and the young to get together. There's a special organic relationship between the oldest in a culture and the youngest in a culture. And this has been lost in a lot of our Caucasian European heritage. Now this also means that elders have to wake up and throw off the oppression you've received from our culture that we're useless. Throw off this word, retirement. I've heard the word far too often the last 2 days from people here. Oh, I'm retired. No, you're not retired. No one's retired. Retired is an obscene word. We should substitute the word refirement for retirement and rewirement for the word retirement. Because when we get older and closer to death, beauty looms bigger than ever in our lives. That's the rewirement. We become more mystical. And we're needed for that very reason. But also the firement. Yes, when your kids have left home and all that good stuff, and you're a grandparent now, still you ask, what is a fire in my belly? And you ask God, you ask the universe, how can I help? And how can I feed the fire in my belly? And I'm sure that 95% of us today are talking about the ecological catastrophe and apocalypse that faces us, and about the youngest, our children, grandchildren, great-children. So, of course, you want to link up with the young people, and they want you. And here's a real important story from science. Just 2 years ago, a woman anthropologist set out to answer the question, why did Neanderthal people die out, and we Homo sapiens are still plugging along, messing things up so effectively? And, of course, she had heard the theory from patriarchal anthropologists that we went to war with all these Neanderthals and we beat them all up, of course. Except that we now know a lot of us are walking around with Neanderthal DNA in us today. So we weren't just making war. Get that straight. We weren't just making war. So that's not an answer. She came up with this answer, and she had a whole team of scientists with her. The Neanderthals tended to die at around the age of 40 or 41. No grandparents, no elders. Our people lived into their 50s. 3 generations were working. And this is why every indigenous tribe I've experienced around the world have a place of honor for the elders. And it's not about tapping them on the head because they got white hair. No. They remember the essential work that elders did. This is what brought our species this far. So what we need today are elder rituals. Churches like this should be creating rituals announcing to the elders that they have very important work, refirement and rewirement, and working intergenerational wisdom with the younger people. Of course, we also need effective rituals for our younger people, rites of passage, which have totally stumbled along the way. But that, to me, is part of, that's why we call this book an intergenerational vision of love and action. And all are welcome. So, I'm sure my time is up now, for sure, and I hope we have some time for questions. Terrific. Okay.
Just while we're getting the walk-around microphones, to give you an opportunity for questions, just advise or share that some of the guidelines that we've been using for our question time, which is to ask you to think carefully and to make your question a question and to keep it succinct. And we're also trying to share the diversity of voices and to make sure there's an opportunity for different perspectives. So we're going to invite, first of all, someone who identifies as female or transgender to ask a question, and then there'll be a time for somebody who identifies as male or non-binary. You don't have to declare, you just have to decide where you want to be. So we will proceed on that method. So a question. You just raise your hand.
Thank you very much for your talk. Amongst progressive millennials, they run hermeneutic Bible studies on university campuses throughout Sydney. It is once said by Philippians 2:6 that although one was in the form of God, one did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited. How do you apply the Bible to the theory of viva creat? I can't even pronounce it, but how do you apply the Bible to the theory that you've explained to us with viva, positiva nava, etc.?
Yes, well, I think Jesus underwent very much these four paths at many levels and in an ever expansive way. In fact, you can from a theological category point of view, you could say that via positiva is about creation. It's about our response. Like I quoted Rabbi Heschel last night, that wonder is the mind, the action of the mind encountering the universe. The universe speaks to us most deeply about wonder. And of course, people who live in cities, you kind of have to believe that because you can't see the stars at night. But we have to understand that for 99% of our existence on this planet, people do not live in cities, and you could see the stars. And of course, the indigenous people who don't, because they're poor, don't have a lot of neon lights and lighting, they're still seeing the stars. One of the deep lessons I learned from Eddie Kneebone, this Aboriginal who was a teacher to me and a good friend, he said to me, we don't teach our children that the stars are so many light years away and all this stuff. We teach our children that the stars are the campfires of our ancestors. And they are up there looking down on Earth to see what's cooking on Earth, looking for our campfires. So notice what that ancient teaching of children teaches people, that we're in a relationship with the stars. It's not just a factual information thing. And of course, we are literally, science now agrees that we are carrying the same elements in our bodies that stars carry, and that it was a supernova explosion out in Father Sky 4.5 billion years ago that gave birth to 40% of our body. And the original fireball gave birth to 60% of our body. 60% of your atoms are hydrogen and helium that were cooked in the original fireball. So we have this relationship with the stars, with the supernovas, with the fireball. So this is what comes first. So that's the via positiva. And of course, Jesus was a peasant farmer. He was close to the earth. And he had all kinds of experiences in nature because that's what most of his stories are built around. Mustard seeds and sheep and goats and lilies in the field. I mean, go through the Bible with these questions in mind and you'll see. And of course, he's from wisdom tradition in Israel, which is about finding God in nature, not primarily in a book. And so you got that. Then the via negativa, of course, the crucifixion is an archetype of that. but Jesus underwent a lot of suffering, a lot of rejection, a lot of hounding, people projecting on him not just negative things, but positive things, people falling in love with him and all that stuff, wanted to make him a guru or something. Well, he fled out to the desert. And of course, the whole baptism experience. Our book, The Stations of the Cosmic Christ, which I did last year, well, the paperback version came out last year with Bishop Mark Andrus, Bishop of San Francisco. We created 16 stations of the cosmic Christ to balance these 14 stations of the cross. And what is clear is that every one of the great feast days in Christianity is set in a cosmic context. For example, the Nativity. Well, there's a manger, there's an ox, there's sheep, there's shepherds, there's stars, there's, quote, pagan astrologers following the star. The first word out of the angel's mouth to the shepherds is glory, doxa, which is the word that names the cosmic Christ, the radiance of divinity, etc. So, I mean, it's just washed. Nativity is washed in the cosmic Christ imagery. But so is the baptism. The sky opened up. Well, I mean, do you need something more cosmic than that? That was a cosmic event. And then what happened right after? Jesus goes out in the desert with lions. We forget that in Jesus' day there were lions in Judah. This guy grew up with lions, studying, apprenticing with John the Baptist. That was his adolescent rite of passage. How was yours? How does yours compare? It made him kind of tough, and he had to be. And then you can go on. Transfiguration, my goodness, that is the climax of the cosmic Christ. And in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, because it did not follow the guilty psychological conscience of Augustine. In fact, an Eastern theologian once said to me, we can't believe that you guys canonized that guy. They ran away from Augustine, and they kept the idea of their number one feast day of the year is not Christmas, it's not Good Friday, it's not Easter, it is the Transfiguration. Because that was a revelation that Jesus was not just a friend and a rabbi, a teacher, he was also, his numinosity came out of him. So you can go through every event. The crucifixion in all four Gospels is set in a cosmic context, not in a context of individual shame and guilt. Every one of them. And just one example is the Gospel where the temple curtain was ripped when Jesus died. And we now know that there were two curtains on the temple at that time, and the outward curtain was a painting of what? The universe. And that's Jewish teaching, that when injustice is done toward the poor and the innocent, all of earth is off kilter. The whole universe breaks. Just like what happens when your heart breaks, your whole universe breaks. Joanna Macy teaches that, the Buddhist. She says, when your heart breaks, the whole universe can pour through. It hurts. You think it's the end of the world. You're in the dark night of the soul. But in fact, it may be an opening up of your soul to grow your soul. And, of course, Jesus was nothing if not a parable teller, a creative rabbi, a teacher who leaned on parables, not on theological doctrine papers, but on parables to tell his stories of God and others. And of course, the transformativa. Well, that's how he got himself killed. You know, if he was just a mystic, he would have been fine to the Roman Empire. But he wasn't. He was rattling the cages of the Roman Empire. Every time he talked about the kingdom of God, the queen of God, his hearers knew he was challenging the empire under which they were suffering. So all of these four paths are played out fully in the life of the historical Jesus. And as I said last night, the cosmic Christ passages in the scriptures are multiple, especially in Paul and especially in Gospel of Thomas. But also Matthew 25 is so interesting because that is the historical Jesus talking about the cosmic Christ. He's stepping out of his personhood as Jesus and saying, I am you when you're hungry. I am you when you're the prisoner. I am you when you're naked. So it's a rare instance of the historical Jesus bringing in the cosmic Christ in his language. And of course, all the I am sayings are the cosmic Christ speaking, not Jesus. Words put into Jesus' mouth by his disciples after he died. But the I am sayings are cosmic Christ sayings. And so the 16 stations, we have those 9 stations of the events of his life that are all festivities in Christianity. And then we have the 7 sayings of the I am. I am the bread and so forth, I am the door. But in the cosmic Christ context, what that means is, how are you a door for others? How are you bread for others? How are we resurrection and life for others? How are we good shepherds, especially at this time of ecological collapse? How are we good shepherds on behalf of the polar bears, the elephants, the tigers, and all that are disappearing? So the Bible is flooded with creation spirituality. And so many, Elie Wiesel, he wrote after my original blessing book, he said to me, he wrote me, and he said, in our tradition, not only is original sin not in Judaism, but it's not, he said, it's the opposite. It's the opposite of our view of the world. That original blessing names what we believe the world is. That's how Genesis begins, after all. It was good, it was good, it was good, it was very good. And good is a word, blessing is just a theological word for goodness. So it's everywhere, and I think this gives us a new paradigm by which to interpret. If I could say one thing I really disagree with a lot of the Jesus Seminar people, and I know they're very important to a lot of people here, and they've been important to me. But I want to talk about resurrection for a minute, because that's one of the cosmic Christ stations, resurrection. I don't like theologians who take scissors to all the resurrection stories and say, oh, this isn't scientific, blah, blah, blah. I say, hold your horses, get out of your libraries and learn something. I have a friend, he's not religious at all. He was raised in California, he's Chinese, but he never had religion, and he's certainly not New Age. And he's a blue-collar worker. He builds things houses with his hands. He taught himself. He's dyslexic and dropped out of college in 2 months. Real special person. And he's not religious. But when his mother died, 3 months later, she appeared to him at the foot of his bed. And they had a conversation. And she said to him, remember the values I've taught you, and so forth. And every time he tells me this story, his eyes well up with tears. Now, everyone here, shut your eyes. I want to shut your eyes, everybody. It's not a contest. Just be true to yourself. How many of you have experienced an experience like this? Someone you loved died, and they returned in some form to communicate with you afterwards. Please raise your hands. Eyes shut. This is not a contest. It's just a checking. Okay, now one more question. Keep your eyes shut. How many of you know people whom you trust, who aren't wacky, to whom they confided to you a story analogous to that story I just told? Raise your hand, please. Okay, thank you. I would say roughly 85% of the people raise their hands to both questions. And these are people who've read these theologians who have snipped out all the stories of the resurrection. So this is not your average group of people. Well, the point I'm making is this. Those stories of resurrection in the Gospels are exactly like what you just raised your hand about. So I do not like the fact that these biblical theologians spend too much time in their libraries, too much time with books and texts, and should start listening to people's stories. Because these are real stories. 80% of you said twice that you know these stories. This is what the resurrection's about. And I'm angry at these narrow-minded theologians who think they have all the answers because they learned a lot of languages one day. They don't. Listen to one another's lives and deep stories, and you'll realize the resurrection stories match perfectly what all these other stories are about. And we do live in communion with our ancestors. We do. And of course, this has been taught as long as humans have been on this planet. So I'm glad I got that in this particular group. naughty that I am. Okay, is that the last question? Another one more?
Okay.
That's it.
I think you've got a captive audience, Matthew, and I think there is one other person who has the microphone at the moment, so we will.
Good.
I think,
Matthew, over here. Thank you. I don't know whether you are aware, but there are a group of men in Queensland who for the last 12 years have been doing Richard Rohr's Men's Rites of Passage every August. And in October, they are running one for young men 18 to 28 for the first time. And it's something people might be interested in knowing about. Would you like to comment on that in the light of your comments about intergenerational wisdom?
Yes, I'm delighted you're doing that, though I'm surprised they've been doing it for 10 years and the young men haven't been, kind of focused on. But yeah, I respect Richard Rohr. I know him. I stopped by his place 6 months ago or so. We had a 2 or 3 hour talk alone in his place there. So I wrote a book on the sacred masculine a few years ago called The Hidden Spirituality of Men, 10 Metaphors to Awaken the Sacred Masculine. Because I'm convinced that this has to be the next stage in feminist awakening as well. That it's not enough that the goddess returns, the goddess deserves a worthy consort. And a lot of masculinity is toxic today in the world. And we have to be conscious of cleaning that up. And it's not just a male problem, because women have souls that are half masculine and half feminine. So a lot of women today are walking around with the toxic masculine inside of them. So they have to clean that up too, in addition to assisting men, whether they be partners or sons or grandsons or uncles or brothers or fathers, co-workers. So this is a task for all of us, men and women alike. When I do workshops based on my book about the sacred masculine, I like to invite men and women. And the results are really stunning and important. Yeah, this is one of the most important issues of our time, and one of the signs of hope. First, that the divine feminine is returning. I'm not going to say she's totally back, because there's all this backlash and the rest, but we've been involved, and women's groups have been involved in bringing the divine feminine back. But when my book on this came out, the first two responses, one was from a woman. She emailed me. That was the very first. She said, I have over 200 books in my personal library at home on the divine feminine, not one on the sacred masculine. And she said, I have 2 teenage sons. She said, now, I do not regret 1 minute of the last 40 years of my life when I've been wrestling to bring the divine feminine back into my life. But she said, you are right. Until I read your book, I didn't realize how much men have suffered under patriarchy. And she said, you are right, the next stage has to be the sacred masculine. And the second response I got was from a Native American in a conference. He came up to me. He was 6'7" with long white hair, very elegant and elegantly dressed. He came up to me and he said, I've been working in prisons for 12 years. He said, men in prison, I've learned, do not want to look inside. They want to project on others. He said, for 12 years, I've been looking for a book that would get men to look inside. And your book is the first book I've got that does it. Because what I'm dealing with in the book is archetypes. Father Sky is the first one. That's cosmology. The Green Man is the second one. And that's incredibly important today. The Green Man is the warrior to defend Mother Earth. And then the Blue Man, and fatherhood, and grandfather, the elder, and the spiritual warrior, and several others. But then he said, what the men do when they finally begin to look inside, and your book allows them to, he said, they find the nobility inside. Now that phrase, I think, is so important. It tells us everything about the male struggle today. That men have lost their sense of their own nobility. And therefore, we're not passing it on to the younger generations. And I go through some of the reasons how we've lost that sense of nobility. Part of it is the killing of Father Sky. If there's no cosmology, then you just hunker down. And of course, the killing of Father Sky came from science, bad science, the idea of a mechanistic universe and a mechanistic sky. But it also was followed up by the capitalist industrial age, where so many men had to hunker down and shut up to go into the mines or to work on factory lines and so forth. As E.F. Schumacher says, we have insurance if your body is wounded at work. There's no insurance if your soul is wounded at work. You're on your own. And a lot of men have been, and then of course going to war and coming back from war and all those stories. We now have a name for it, you know, that syndrome, PTSD, whatever it is. But, you know, all wars wreak havoc on the male psyche, well, women too, but more men than women, because there are more men and women going to war. Unless you have a very strong spiritual base, and most people are not so grounded. So your work, I really praise it. It's so important. It's one of the most important works on the planet today, because men are in deep trouble. In my culture, in America today, 5 times more men commit suicide than women. 5 times. A woman wrote an article about this fact a year or two ago. She said, if this was happening with women, if it was reversed, we women would be having circle discussions all the time. You men aren't even talking about it. You're not meeting with one another. You're not strategizing. You're not asking, why is this happening? And what should we do about it? And a lot of young men, as you know, are wandering around, quite lost. And for good reason, because they don't want to be like Donald Trump. You know, that's not their definition of manhood, to have gold toilets. Donald Trump has gold toilets, you know. There's a big discussion whether there's one in the White House yet or not. We don't know, but he has them in his other homes. But anyway, I cheer you on for the work you're doing. Very important. Yes?
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. It's all right. Thank you so much, Matthew.